How do we know who we can trust and who we can't? Who's reliable? Who does a high quality job? How does the man in the street know when he picks a journal up that this is a journal that will have done a proper due diligence, for want of a better word, and won't be publishing rubbish?
This is the problem. The average non-academic person is not qualified to judge what is coming out of identity studies in the same way I couldn't evaluate a physics paper. So we do need people with expertise in those fields, and we need them to be doing their job properly. So a lot of our work was aimed at people in the humanities who are reasonable, who value evidence, who value ethical consistency, to try to get them not to, out of some kind of loyalty to colleagues or a feeling that any kind of work which looks at social justice issues must be good, they turn a blind eye to the really terrible scholarship, and we want them to stop doing that. We want them to criticise it, and we want them to be able to criticise it without being accused of being white supremacists, misogynists, or whatever else. So that whole field, that whole process of social justice scholarship and how it is evaluated really needs to be overturned. It needs to be made rigorous so that people can trust it again. Because the worst thing that could happen from this is that people will no longer trust anything that's coming out about social injustice. They are going to be inclined to dismiss genuine cases of racism, sexism, homophobia, unless we can make the information that's coming out more reliable.
One thing that worries me enormously as somebody who was involved in public life for a long time is the breakdown of trust in our institutions. And the academic work in Australia that you can rely on in this field, I know, is the Australian National University's work on trust in our federal parliament. Distrust is at a very, very high level. Trust is at a very, very low level by historical standards. Quite frightening stuff. You could say the same of a number of other institutions. Immense damage is done to the standing of many institutions by the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse. We've had one into banks, we've got one into aged care. In this country, our universities are on a knife edge. I don't think they realise it yet, but they're in grave danger of losing the confidence, I think, of the people who support them, the Australian taxpayers. We see it on a whole number of fronts. But internationally, where do you think academia stands now in terms of being trusted and being trustworthy?
This is something that worries us particularly. This is why we put out a piece of principled defence of the university before we revealed anything, because our greatest fear is that the undermining of confidence in certain kinds of identity studies is going to feed into populist and anti-intellectual demands to dissolve universities. They are going there. There is so much danger that people will generally lose confidence not only in some bizarre theoretical scholarship, but in scholarship itself. So that is something that I think we need to address. People have criticised us, saying that our project feeds in to the undermining of confidence in the universities, but I don't think that argument works, because if there is genuinely a problem, we cannot deal with it by pretending it doesn't exist and hoping the critics don't notice either. They've noticed. We need to be seen to try and fix it.
Helen, if nothing else comes out of this conversation, it's that. You know, when there's a problem, it needs to be put out into the open, into the sunlight, so that people know there's a problem. It can't be escaped. You can't get around it anymore. So I think that's a really important observation. If we accept that postmodernism is a prevailing orthodoxy now on most campuses across the Western world, it might be useful to stop and think about what it is. And you actually have said, and I think this is quite brilliant, the defining quality of postmodernism is a move away from the aim for objective truth, both morally and factually. Can you elaborate on that so that a layman might have a better understanding of what postmodernism really is?
Yeah, I can certainly break down this conception of society, which I think is important for people to get a grip on. But I think when we say postmodernism has control of campuses, I think we're looking at an evolved form of it, which has some power over campus culture and some departments. I still insist that the majority of scholarship that is coming out of universities is sound. The majority of students and faculty are not postmodern thinkers, but that's not to say it isn't a dominant orthodoxy at the moment when it comes to social justice and identity issues. That at root, the postmodernism has what we've called a knowledge principle and a political principle. So the political principle is that society is formed of structures of power and privilege and marginalisation. So society is set up to protect the interests of heterosexual, white, Western, rich men. And everybody on the other side of those, as well as disabled and fat people, are on the bottom of this hierarchy of power. And this works through discourses. It's the way we talk about things. We constantly keep each other in our places by talking in certain ways about things, so that perhaps we'd say things which indicate we think men should take the lead and women should take a back seat, and that your doctor should be white and your gardener should be non-white. And so it's these kind of discourses which they see as permeating society and keeping everybody in their place. So objective knowledge, in this sense, it comes from this conception of society as constructing knowledge through these power discourses. So Foucault called it power knowledge. So we think what seems so obvious and true to us is actually just a construct of these systems of power.
It'd be useful for us, I think, if we had some understanding of how postmodernism has evolved. If I could preface my remarks, giving away my own biases a little, G.K. Chesterton once observed that when men stop believing in God, they start believing in anything. Mm-hmm. It does seem to me that we were promised that this new secular age would lead to a greater objectivity, more rational thinking, more reason, less subjective thinking, and yet we seem to be less committed to objectivity than ever.
Yeah, I don't think that the postmodern culture can be considered secular in any meaningful way. It has an awful lot of the same qualities as religion. And we've talked a lot about wanting a kind of secularism which includes social justice ideas, in that you can hold them, you can practice them, you can live your life according to them, you can't institutionalize them. So in that sense, I think we are thinking very much of postmodernism as not a religion itself, but as equivalent to one in the sense of fulfilling social and psychological needs. I don't think, as many conservative intellectuals have claimed recently, that the problem of postmodernism is a direct result of the decline of religion. That doesn't seem to fit geographically.
And I don't think, I wouldn't have said that either. It's just that there's been, if you like, a marked decline in objectivity and thinking that we were told would, not happen if we broke away from the chains of religion.
Yeah, what we are seeing with postmodernism is a break away from religion, certainly to a certain extent in the sense of Christianity. It can be very positive towards minority religions and spiritual practices, but we're also seeing, more importantly, a break away from liberalism, from modernity, from that understanding of society in which arguments have to be reasoned, evidence has to be provided, ethics have to be consistent. So the postmodernists are called such because they are in opposition to modernity. And by that, they do mean this rise of secularism, this rise of liberalism, and this scientific, evidence-based way of looking at things. They see this as a construct of the West, which is really a product of straight white men, that it disadvantages unfairly other forms of knowledge which are seen to belong to people of minority racial or cultural identification. It disadvantages women, trans people, the disabled, because it's all been constructed in the service of dominant groups in society. So the original postmodernists, what I would call the first wave of them, they appeared in the late 1960s. And they are best understood as a manifestation of complete despair at the breakdown of Marxism. So Marxism had proved itself not to work. There was a great disillusionment amongst leftist academics, and postmodernism really can best be defined as, can we trust anything anymore? And so they're talking about meta-narratives. That's those large overarching explanations for things which keep us sort of unified and focused. So they criticised Christianity, they criticised Marxism, and they criticised science. And then we're left with a big mess, really, because we can't count on anything. Even language is unreliable. So the original postmodernists are characterised by despair. But then in the late 1980s, we saw a second wave, and that's recovered some hope and some attempt to rebuild things. So we had people like Mary Poovey in feminism, Kimberlé Crenshaw in critical race theory, and they appeared all at once and they started saying, well, postmodernism has some good ideas with cultural constructivism and systems of power, but we have to accept that some objective truth exists. If we can't say that there is a group of people called women and they experience certain disadvantages because they are women, we can't do anything. So what became true in the second wave that we call applied postmodernism is that it was accepted as objectively true that these systems of power and privilege exist and everything else is culturally constructed. So we have to start with the assumption that this imbalance is going to exist within any interaction that happens, and then we have to look at how the prejudice has been constructed in language and in attitudes around it. So that was the next wave, and that's what we see most in theories like queer theory and post-colonial theory, critical race theory. And then in the last sort of 5 to 10 years, we've seen a new wave altogether, which has brought all of these theories, queer theory and critical race theory and feminism, all into a big mess that I just tend to call social justice scholarship. And it's making a really strong objective truth claim. The language now is really certain. In the first postmodernists, it was difficult to follow what they were saying because it was so obscure, it was so doubtful, they couldn't be sure of anything. Now we have things like, all white people are racist, black people cannot be racist. And these terms of absolute certainty, which is the third stage. And in a way, it's a hopeful thing because we can understand them now, we know what they're saying, and we can argue with it.
Yeah, the return of absolutism is a very interesting development.
Yeah.
Because moral relativity doesn't allow for it. It says that there's no such thing as truth. There aren't no absolutes.
Yeah.
Except for the absolute, that there are no absolutes.
Exactly.
But you're saying we've moved beyond that. And we're now seeing the emergence of some absolutes. Anybody who dares to argue with social justice warriors will very quickly discover, I think, today, that they do actually believe in absolutes.
Yes.
So to backtrack from that, if postmodernism doesn't think truth, though, is really attainable, even if they're moving a bit on that, that evidence has to be discounted in favour of looking for the social drivers, if you like, and constructs of the world that we live in, how can that be anything other than corrosive for the idea of a university dedicated to the pursuit of understanding and truth?
Well, you're not going to get an argument from me that it can be considered any other way. I think that there's some good stuff coming out of this, but the premises are so very bad. So often when I'm reading some papers and books around these kind of theories, I see some really sharp thinkers who are thinking rigorously, but they're starting from very bad premises. So I am actually quite a fan of Jose Medina and Christy Dotson, who are epistemologists, and they do some really solid work, but they've started from the premise that knowledge is tied to identity. There is a way that men think, there's a way that women think, black people, white people, and they're building from that. And so their theories cannot work because this simply isn't the case that all men think the same or all women do. This doesn't work. But I am hopeful if we could change the tide. There are some good scholars in there who could apply their ideas productively. So that, I think, is the silver lining in there. There are still smart people. They are still ethically motivated. But I think they've gone wrong. But on top of that, there's an awful lot of scholars who are really just taking advantage of the ability to write total theoretical fluff without substance, and I have no sympathy for them.
Thank you for watching this episode. We appreciate your support. If you value vital conversations like this one, be sure to subscribe to the channel there and also click the notification bell to stay up to date with new releases.